got a wonderful panel of guests here. Very good morning. I was introduced. I am Geetha. I'll be the moderator this morning. And I warmly again welcome you to the Unite SPLD 2019 conference, and this is our panel discussion. So let me introduce you to our panelists here. Professor Angela Fawcett, who's sitting right here, is a leading international researcher in dyslexia and other developmental disabilities, encompassing a range of theoretical and applied contributions to this field. Her approach is broad and interdisciplinary, ranging from child and cognitive development to educational screening and intervention, as well as developmental cognitive neuroscience. She is the Vice President of the British Dyslexia Association and also the former Chair and Director of the Centre for Child Research at the Swansea University, UK. She is currently a research advisor to the Dyslexia Association of Singapore and the Registrar of the RETA, which is the Register of Educational Therapists Asia. So thank you, Angela, for joining us. Next, we have, closest to me right here, PHYLLIS Money. Let me get your bio right up. Yep. So PHYLLIS is the founder and the director of the Dyslexia Association Kenya and Rare Gem Talent School, a school founded by DOK to cater to children with dyslexia in Kenya. She holds a master's degree in child and family development, a BCom in human resource management, high diploma in human resources management, and certificate in the teaching of children with dyslexia, certificate in supporting children with difficulties in reading and writing. PHYLLIS has led the Dyslexia Organization Kenya to a partnership with international organizations, championing the cause of dyslexia in the world. As a member of the International Dyslexia Association Global Partners, PHYLLIS has participated in research on good practice in interventions for teaching dyslexic learners and in teacher training in English-speaking countries, and conducted research on the psychological challenges experienced by children with reading difficulties in upper primary schools. Apart from managing all of that, which is huge in itself, PHYLLIS is also a mother of 2 young adult boys and 1 who has dyslexia. Welcome, PHYLLIS. Now I'm going to head to the lady in black and gray, matching my color scheme today. That's Mandy Natan. Mandy Natan is the CEO of DSF Literacy and Clinical Services and President of AUSPELD, which is the Australian Federation of Specific Educational Learning Difficulties Association. She is an educational and developmental psychologist and qualified primary school teacher with extensive experience in the field of literacy education. Mandy supports students with literacy planning and provides professional development in the areas of literacy acquisition, vocabulary development, working memory, learning difficulties, and the assessment of learning disorders. In particular, I and many of us find the work that she does with the Aboriginal population quite fascinating. So thank you for joining us, Mandy. And then to the lady who is actually wearing my favorite color, green. That's Masarrat Khan. Masarrat Khan is the Chief Executive Officer of the Maharashtra Dyslexia Association, MDA for short, a global partner of the International Dyslexia Association. She holds master's degrees in clinical psychology and English literature from Mumbai University and is a structured literacy dyslexia specialist. Also a certified academic language therapist. Ms. Khan has an invaluable experience of 3 decades in the area of learning disabilities. She is the course coordinator for the Dyslexia Therapist Training Program being offered by MDA in collaboration with the Multi-Sensory Language Training Institute of New Mexico. She is a pre-primary and primary curriculum developer and trainer for English language and maths. Ms. Khan was one of the primary investigators in the development of DALI, the Dyslexia Assessment for Languages of India, and has co-authored research on ancestral variations of the PCDHG gene cluster predisposed to dyslexia in a multiplex, and another paper on determination of marginalized youth to overcome and achieve in mathematics, a case study from India. Further, she's contributed to the booklet, Are You Aware?, aimed at increasing awareness in parents and caregivers on the importance of early detection of developmental delays in children. She's currently working on a research project on Importance of Phonological Awareness and Phonics Instruction. Welcome, Masarrat. And of course, we have the only gentleman in our panel, Siang, whom I know very well. So, Siang joined DAS on the 15th of December, so specific, in 2001, and assumed the post of CEO on the 1st of September 2014. He also sits on the board of DS subsidiaries, the DS Academy and DS International. Siang was a member of the US-based International Dyslexia Association from 2016 to 2018 and chair of their Global Partners Committee from 2016 to 2018. He still remains a member of the Global Partners Committee representing Singapore. He has played a key role in the rapid growth of DAS into a thriving social enterprise with a multidisciplinary professional workforce that provides a continuum of services. He emphasizes that DAS must strive, and he does, must strive to fulfill our social mission by combining entrepreneurial and business skills with the philanthropic characteristics of non-profits. Siang obtained his bachelor's from the National University of Singapore via sponsorship from the Singapore Armed Forces. He also has a certificate in dyslexia studies, a postgraduate certificate in teaching and learning in higher education, and a postgraduate certificate in specific learning differences. That it doesn't end there. He's also got a postgraduate diploma in financial management and an MBA from the University of Western Australia. So it is this unique balance of experiences and qualifications that have allowed Siang to oversee the diverse services and functions of the DS family. So thank you for joining us, Siang. So we have some interesting questions from the audience. So let's get straight into it. And my first question really is to set the scene. Angela, we know that education can help eradicate poverty, and we know and education can only help those with poverty overcome their challenges. So is it a fact then that poverty might be both a cause and an effect of a lack of access to education?
It's definitely a cycle of deprivation and failure. What tends to happen is that you come into school, you have poor language to start with, your executive function is not good, you don't learn well, you don't know what school is about, and so you fail in school. You then go on into adult life with no qualifications, you leave school early, you may get into the wrong company. So many of these children will end up in prison, really successful at doing badly, in fact. That's where they may be most successful. And as they develop their relationships, then often poor relationships, they can be unemployed long-term, involved with drugs even, mental health issues, and that permeates through their lives and into their children's lives because they don't have the skills to actually help their children. They're frustrated and angry, and there are many psychological and psychiatric problems. So it's something that destroys society, and we really do need to intervene to fix this, to make sure that our society is not brought down by this failure and this whole tranche of society, which can no longer achieve its potential.
So when we talk about the vicious cycle of poverty, vicious cycle of learning disabilities, that's clearly impacting many people.
Cumulative, yes.
And I mean, if you recall the case study of that boy whom we perhaps could have picked up on the possibility of him, of his eventual situation where he ended up in being incarcerated.
Yes.
And if you think about how when he was born, the conditions were such that it almost favored him entering into that sort of a situation.
Yes, it was almost preordained,
yes,
that this was a self-fulfilling prophecy, that this child would fail.
Yes.
And so without intervention, without support from people like the DAS, they are going to be in that situation again and again and again, and it's a cycle that we can't break out of.
Yes. And yet some people have said that sometimes access to things that are crucial for survival, so survival and basic needs, if these are lacking in a particular community, and we should then focus our resources in addressing those issues more immediately, and perhaps not distract, and I use this word because I've seen it being said, I'm sorry, I've read it as well, and that we should not distract the priorities by throwing in issues such as specialist education. Let's tackle the more serious issues first and talk about basic needs. Now, Masarrat, I wanted to ask you, how does that sort of opinion resonate with you?
Doesn't resonate at all. Talking about, the basic needs and when you talk about special education needs, they are two different things, according to me. Just because there is a population who does not have access to basic needs does not mean we deprive them of, their special needs. Basic needs can be taken care of, by providing them with food or clothing or shelter, which requires financial help, yes. But when you talk about special needs, I'm sure, there are a lot of people out there, like DAS, like all the dyslexia organizations all over, and you have a lot of other, organizations working in the field of mental health and special needs, who are, focused on developing skills of people who are lacking in certain skills, but have certain talents, have certain, skills which need to be tapped and, given the necessary training. And for that, you have a lot of volunteers who can, chip in. So, yes, it requires funds, but you have a whole lot of people who have, who volunteer, and we have seen that in India. You all must be aware, there's a lot of poverty in India, but that does not mean that the ones who are, lacking in financial skills are deprived of education, even the basic education. So you have a lot of organizations who work specifically with children whom we call over there the underprivileged, children, by providing them. So in India, you will find, classes being run under the flyovers because of lack of space. You have, even individuals who volunteer, who after their working hours will go into the slums and provide food to attract the children towards them, and then, set up a class and start teaching them. So I feel that providing special education needs or basic education needs is not something that requires a lot of funds or resources. If you have people with a lot of concern who want to reach out, who think for, the betterment of the society, we have a lot of volunteers out there, and it's just possible. So even schools, government schools, they have, midday meals scheme to attract children, so, and to make it viable for the parents, because if the parents cannot provide the meal to the child, so okay, the school is providing meals, so that is one way of attracting the children to the school.
Yes. So it's almost as if we are redefining what basic needs mean. It doesn't exclude special intervention or special help. It actually means to have a larger understanding of what those basic needs are and come up with almost a master plan that incorporates things like the issue of volunteerism and, of course, corporate funding and individual passion, etc. And we know that many countries, individually, as far as education is concerned, will have their priorities. And we're actually quite interested, Phyllis, to try and understand what Kenya's focus is right now as far as education is concerned.
Thank you, Geetha. In Kenyan government, the focus in education is one of the well-funded ministries in the government. And the focus right now is free primary and secondary education to everybody, and it is mandatory. And there is a renewal of curriculum development. We are currently changing from exam-based curriculum, where the focus was only on performance, and you could see people focusing on passing the exam, which was making even cheating in exam very high. But right now, the current, it is being implemented where it is competency-based curriculum. And this you find it will help even children who have special need, those who are, including the hidden special need that we have, like dyslexia. The focus is like, now it is going to be those who are well-talented in academics will get their growth in the education curriculum, and those who are not able to pass exams and those who are competency talented, they will also grow. Such, you'll find that they will develop a career. It is something that is being developed right now. It has just been from grade 1 to grade 4 right now, and it is growing. The other factor is that the government has also improved funding in TVET, the Technical Vocational Training Education. This also helps the people who are not able to pass the exam and go on to the universities and all that. They can also work and get the hands-on. So there is, we'll say, improved awareness in helping all children across board. The challenge that we have is about the teacher training curriculum that has not embraced the hidden disabilities like the learning difficulties. You find the only people who learn about these conditions are the ones who are in special need education. Whereas you find dyslexia is available everywhere. We are like 15 to 17% children in government in a country have dyslexia. And so you find if only teachers who are trained on special education are the ones who learn about these hidden disabilities, they will not cater for all. The children are not able to be up, they are not able to identify in the schools where there are no special ed teachers. So maybe the focus now should be having all teachers, regardless of whether they're in the special ed or not, like learn the basic identification and intervention of learners with the hidden disabilities. Yeah.
Right. So I'm wondering, is that the same concern Australia has, teacher training, as far as special educational needs are concerned?
Absolutely. We have a lot of concerns about teacher training in terms of both, I guess, the quality of instruction in reading, as in the teachers going into schools and having a really strong knowledge of the science of reading and therefore how to teach reading well. And alongside that, the capacity to really identify those students who perhaps have an underlying learning disorder, so a persistent and enduring difficulty that is not responding well to good quality instruction. I think when the instruction is not of a really high quality, then what happens is that the students start getting a little bit lost. And if teachers are not well trained to both identify children at risk and then know how to intervene in the most successful way, then we're going to end up, unfortunately, with a lot of children kind of creeping through the system who are struggling, which is what I think is happening in a lot of English-speaking countries at the moment. We're seeing a lot of poor results right the way through to Year 12. So I think, it's a bit of a double-edged sword in terms of ensuring that teachers have the knowledge and the skills to both teach really well, and when you are working with more disadvantaged students, then there is an even greater sense of urgency to have an impact as quickly as possible. And unfortunately, I think sometimes in the more disadvantaged areas, that urgency isn't there. What is there is more of maybe an attempt to engage students or get them in the door, rather than actually we've got 6 hours here or 6.5 hours to really make a difference and narrow the gap. Yeah. So, yeah.
And Mandy, I know you're a firm believer of evidence-based instruction.
100%.
Yes. And so
Maybe evidence-informed instruction, perhaps, but yes, 100%.
And so it becomes very important that our teachers are going in there with the right set of skills and expertise to support these learners the right way, in a timely fashion. So yeah, teacher training is critical, and that's something I think all countries are, I suppose, really focusing on and looking at. And at the same time, I suppose, is the question about the home environment. And this question, Mandy, I wanted to ask you. So we know the home environment is critical when it comes to literacy learning, the language exposure, as well as the emphasis given to learning at home. And since you've done a lot of work, especially with the Aboriginal learners, how does poverty impact that community? Okay, well, I think that there are some really unique challenges to the Aboriginal population in Australia. One of the initial ones that comes to mind is isolation. So some of the communities that I visit are perhaps even 700 or 800 kilometres from the nearest community. So to get to them takes 2 days. It takes me longer to get to one of these remote communities than it does to get to England. So I can get on a plane and fly to England and be there now in 16 and a half hours, a direct flight, Perth to London. It will take me 2 days by travelling up to one community, then getting on a mail plane very early in the morning the next day and ending up in a very remote community. When you have that kind of level of remoteness, you also have a lack of resources coming into those communities, so access to kind of professional services and a whole range of other areas. What we see as well with these communities is, unfortunately, poverty and linked to poverty is health issues. Linked to health issues may be nutritional needs, may be persistent ear infections, which then has issues with regard to phonological awareness development and a whole lot of other things. In addition, we have a population that speaks in some areas some of the oldest languages on the planet. So being very quarantined from other language influences, we have these languages that are home languages that are completely different from other languages, and they're certainly very different from English. So the teachers going into these communities are faced with children coming through the door who do not speak any English and who speak a language that is fundamentally very different from English in terms of the phonological structure, which of course makes teaching phonics very difficult, and given that we know that phonics is an absolutely essential and integral part of a really good reading, spelling, written expression curriculum, then there's some big challenges there. So I think these things all kind of come together. The poverty, which in terms of health issues and a whole range of other issues, lack of resources, lack of professional services, people not necessarily wanting to go and teach in these areas. It's a long way, and you generally don't have mobile phone coverage, and most young people these days find that to be an almost that would be
extraordinary thing. So there are a lot of issues. One of the things we've been working on with a lot of these communities is the development of language activity kits. So these are home language materials that are developed in local languages like Nganandara and Pitandara and a whole range of other really unique languages, where we train the children and the teachers in phonological awareness activities in home language, which then can act as a bridge into standard Australian English. So it does a lot of things. One, we're seeing some real improvement in phonological and phonemic awareness, which is really critically important. But two, I think it's really sending a very positive message about the valuing of the language, respect for the language, respect for the community. So, yeah.
Wow. And I assume funding is always a challenge?
Funding?
Yes.
Massive, of course, a huge challenge all of the time. And actually to run programs out in these areas is incredibly expensive and difficult. And again, as I mentioned before, I feel, and as do many others, a huge sense of urgency with this. And what we need to be delivering all of the time has to be the absolute best quality. Absolutely.
Agreed.
Yeah.
And I mean, funding is often linked to what policymakers or lawmakers define as an urgent need, or perhaps, even in terms of definition of special education, or what is a learning disability. And in some countries, the definition of learning disabilities in special education law actually excludes learners whose problems might be exacerbated by economic challenges. And therefore reflecting the belief that poverty is purely an external factor and one that we would have to address almost separately from the issue of education. So neuroscience research, though, suggests that the conditions associated with poverty can have internal and physical effects on the brain. So there appears to be this blurring now between an internal disorder and external circumstances with learning disabilities. So, Siang, what do you think? Is it time for the laws and support definitions to be redefined? What should we do?
Well, first of all, before I address that, I just to say to my fellow panelists that I'm really glad that we were able to have this sharing, because the challenges that you guys face really puts the challenges that we face here in Singapore in perspective. Right? I think, what should countries do? We know that children from impoverished backgrounds, they are impacted by a lack of exposure to the language. They are sometimes impacted by delayed brain maturation, and very often they are also, it also results in the development of negative social behavior. So how can we preempt these things? How can we reduce the impact of these things? And in my opinion, the answer is something that we have been discussing a lot, and that is early identification, early intervention. And I think Singapore is working towards that. For our overseas colleagues, you may not know, for our children who are behind in terms of their language development, in primary 1 and primary 2, we have this thing called the Learning Support Program. So those who are behind will attend the LSP, primary 1, primary 2. Many of them, towards the end of primary 2, the school will then identify and diagnose them for dyslexia. And if they are dyslexic, they will then go on to a school dyslexia remediation program in primary 3 and primary 4. Right. Now, on top of that, the government funds the DES main literacy program that complements the learning support program and the school dyslexia remediation program. So if a child is identified earlier and can access intervention at primary 1, they can come to the DES. If the child needs continued support after primary 4, they can also come to the DES, right? So I think we must be thankful that our government has been very proactive in this area. Can we do better than this? I think we can. Should we move the process earlier, meaning starting in preschool? I think we should have that conversation. But I think the learning support program, the school dyslexia remediation program, and the DES main literacy program provides us with a very good platform for us to develop from here. So first of all, early identification, early intervention. I think secondly, countries should consider different levels of funding. Right? What do I mean? So again, looking at Singapore, how does the government fund the DES main literacy program? So first of all, they provide every child with dyslexia standard funding, right? So that reduces their cost for coming to the DES, right? Secondly, those who come from lower income families, they also qualify for additional financial assistance. And I think Geetha mentioned in your presentation yesterday that over 60% of this group will qualify for 100% waiver of fees, right? So when you talk about funding, we shouldn't just talk about funding dyslexics in general. You should also be funding dyslexia and poverty. So these are two of the things that I think countries can do.
And I think yourself as well as PHYLLIS. Sure, Angela. Yes.
Can I just add something there in terms of the neuroscience, that in fact the brain is very, very plastic. The brain is just wanting to learn. And so we can actually change the outcomes for these children if we intervene early, because you can build up the connections within the brain which will allow the development to continue. And so it's something that's like self-fulfilling, propelling. Once you get the brain going, then it will go. And what everyone can do with no funds is work on the child's spoken vocabulary. Just as a parent, as a teacher, as a volunteer, helping the children to recognise, to learn new words, to be fascinated by language, to be intrigued by language, to seek out information. That will change the way that a child learns. And it's something that can be done very easily without added funds. So that's something that we can all do, that we can be looking at intriguing the child with language, helping them to see how exciting language can be, not just from books, but from talking. Encourage the child to talk, to tell you stories, and that's something which comes freely to us all, and something that you may need to be trained to support parents with, but it's something which is really, really powerful.
And I take from that therefore we all have a part to play, we can all contribute, and it's never too late.
No, absolutely.
Yes. So, I mean, this question came from a member of the audience, and I think it's related to the topic of parents who have a low educational background and are economically challenged. How do we make them understand what dyslexia is? And I think the distinction here is that awareness raising has been significant in Singapore and in many countries now, and the idea of dyslexia, I think, amongst the educated or the well-informed parents, it's fairly clear. If we're talking about a population of people who have different priorities and are struggling with basic needs, is there a different way to approach them as far as making them truly appreciate what dyslexia is for their children?
I think the best way to do it is to work from pre-birth with pregnant mothers. We've actually done this at home, but now the funds are cut for that. There's something called Sure Start, which started in America, which has been used in the UK widely. And you get a group of parents who fulfill all those impoverished, low skills, and you take the mothers particularly, and you skill them up. You talk to them about children. You help them to understand how to deal with a naughty toddler, how to help with the executive functions, how to, rather than slap and chastise, to develop the skills. And that's had a fantastic effect, changing not only the child, but the whole family, because the mother is very much the centre of the family, I think. And that impacts not just on an individual child, but on the whole family and the children that follow. And that has tremendous power. Something which runs quite cheaply, really. Is it done in other countries with children from birth?
Yes and no. I guess there are a lot of programs, not so much about the dyslexia aspect, I guess, but just what we're finding is a lot of work in lower socioeconomic communities on how to help your child and to help the school in the early reading process, and to understand that value of spoken language, critically important, rhyming, games, singing, acting, all of the various things that we do. But it's not so much about the dyslexia. It's really about early language, early literacy, early learning, and therefore being able to pick up those students who do have persistent and enduring difficulties. I think when it comes to that particular group, then one of the issues that I've seen certainly over the years is where the parents themselves have obviously had a lot of difficulty at school. Not obviously, but in many cases have. And as you were pointing out yesterday in your great presentation, that therefore maybe their expectations are not as high, or maybe they see this as almost a self-fulfilling process. And so I think it's actually ensuring that we meet the needs of those families by letting them know that we can raise the aspirations, that we can be ambitious for their children, and that we can work with them to be really positive and ambitious. So, yeah.
And I find this quite fascinating. I mean, we always talk about ingest, of course, that, you know, there are marriage preparatory courses, there are, you know, even when couples get engaged in Singapore, there is something called engaged, some marriage engagement and engaged prep course. And we always commend that there's nothing really for parents. I mean, we all assume that when the child is born, we'll be ready parents. And it's fascinating that we're actually talking about something like pre-service teachers. These are pre-parents courses. And which can then encompass a better understanding of what to look for and how to help your child grow to be a healthy, happy person.
There are all sorts of exciting things if you have an iPhone with apps that tell you what your baby should be doing this week. And that's wonderful because it leads you to have the right expectations. Instead of saying my child is 6 months and can't walk and talk, you know that they're just not old enough. And you deal with the frustrations of being a parent much better when you know, this is a phase, and it will pass. And that's a wonderful weapon to have, to know that.
Siang?
We have talked a lot about engaging the families from low-income families to help their children. And of course, there are many programs in place to do so. But very often we, at least in Singapore, we do see sometimes limited results or limited response from these families. So for example, the DES provides funding for parents to attend training courses at our DES Academy to learn more about the condition and also to help their children at home. But the take-up rate has been fairly low. All right, I think it's less than 10%, despite the fact that the funding is available. We also know that there is significant absenteeism from students, whether it is with our own program, right? Even if they are funded up to 100%, there is still the problem of absenteeism. Right? And of course, we know like institutions like the Institute of Technical Education, schools like Assumption Pathways and Northlight, they also face challenges with attendance. So I've been asking myself, should we rethink the priority that we are giving to engagement of parents for those from lower income families? I'm not saying that that's not important. We must continue to do it. But does society, does the country need to take a much larger role in lifting the bottom? Because we do know that families with less resources have limitations.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's what studies have also shown in terms of parents engaging with their teachers, engaging with school, communities. It's limited. I mean, I read a research paper that suggested that children from low or disadvantaged backgrounds should be given opportunities for leisure and play. And yet, free recreational activities like even going to a park, it's largely one of the main contributing factors on how often you access free recreational places like parks is your family income. So households that have limited income wouldn't be in a position even, for a variety of reasons, to access these free recreational activities. So it's interesting that there are other limitations and which we need to explore in order to truly support this population of people. And yet when we talk about expense to education, and we know Singapore spends quite a bit, parents do spend a considerable amount of money to educate their children. And I read that in Africa, while education is theoretically free, that in practice there are these informal fees that parents are forced to pay for items like uniforms or books, pens, that they consider compulsory for education, which then actually worsens certain families' situation as far as their basic needs are concerned. And by basic needs, they're referring to food and clothing, etc. But what are your comments on that, Phyllis?
Okay, from the Kenyan perspective, we find that although the education is mandatory and free up to secondary level, there are things that parents must provide. The uniform, it's the responsibility of the parents. The books, to some extent, but the government provides the books. But where the challenge is that the number of children or the rate, the ratio of one book to the number of children that the book can be used by the number of children, especially in the free primary education. We have two categories of schools. We have the government funded and we have the private schools. Private schools, everything is the responsibility of the parent. Again, we have free, the category of these private schools is dependent on the income of the parent. There are those higher land, and there is, even in the slums, we have the private schools where the parent is the one responsible. So the challenge is that now the government-funded schools, the number of children are very many. The teachers are not, the ratio of child to parent to children is very high. You find like one child to 40 kids or even 70 children in a class. So even the teacher identifying a child who needs special or need that support is a challenge. The teacher will just move on with the most, the one who is intelligent or bright, but the ones who are poor. And so poor in terms of academic, and you find because of the parents' level of income, the children from poor families will still lag behind and they won't be identified, even when they have learning difficulties. So it will look like now children from poor background tend to be seen to be like the one who are mostly in special need, because there is no special treatment or identification on support that given to this child, because they won't be identified. Whereas where the most economic background, the parents will go and look for support. They will be able to find the children and will be able to support and even get the resources to support this child. Currently, what we have in Kenya is like nearly, like would say about 60% people have ability to get to the internet through their mobile phones, their smartphones. So sometimes it's easier for our parents to just, like she said, just type and my child is not doing this, my child cannot read, and then you'll be able to see, get results. If you say your child, if you type my child cannot read, most likely you'll find this is a condition called dyslexia. So as a parent, you'll inform the teacher and it's likely to get help. But we still have parents who cannot do that because of lack of the technology. So their children will continue becoming lack of support. They won't get support and the teachers are not able to. Then again, the challenge we have is the teachers from public schools, they lack, like would say, initiative because the huge number of children that they have in a class. So they will still not find any support, and yet again they are not trained to identify this. But in the private schools, there is some kind of support because they get the support from parents. We also have the other kind of parents who are not able to afford the uniform, they cannot afford the books, and they're in the very far off areas, like I would understand what Mandy said, those very far off areas where there's the education is really provided by the government. The parents, again, have not been educated, so they don't value the education. So we have those kind of levels, and to identify the learners with challenges is very, very hard. But the government would say they are doing their best because of the funding that is being given. The lack of uniform, lack of books is, again, it is not a requirement in some places that a child have to have uniform. is the mandatory requirement is first the child has to be in school. Whether they are uniform, however they are dressed, that's not a requirement. That again is helping. Previously, you could find a parent or a child being sent home by a school teacher because they didn't have uniform. That does not happen right now. Yeah.
So that's an improvement
Yeah.
in terms of understanding the reality of what these children face.
Yes.
And still yet, about hidden costs, Masarrat, I wanted to ask you this question. Again, in something that I read, an observation was made that the lack of functioning public schools means that for parents, they have no choice but to send their children to private schools, even if they are low-fee private schools. And yet they remain unaffordable for the poorest families. Then they risk themselves, they take loans to make themselves destitute almost in order to get their children into a school because they want to better their lives, basically. I wanted to understand if that was a common experience in India, or, I mean, would you say that this is particularly stressful for families living with learning disabilities, this sort of access to schools?
We have a lot of government schools, and we also have something called municipal schools. But the thing is that a lot of the municipal schools are there to cater to the poorest of poor. But there is this general, misconception or belief that the quality of education provided over there is not good because it's free. So a lot of, parents who are barely, managing to make ends meet also want to put their children in schools, pay fees and, admit their children in schools with the hope that, we did not get the kind of education because of which we are struggling to make ends meet. So we want to provide the best of education to our children so that they are, they lead a better quality of life. So there is this conflict and dilemma where, India is concerned. Like the government does have provisions, but there are very few takers. And you have one class which is, very, very poor, which we say it's below the poverty line. They are the ones like, they are on the streets and in the slums, and the parents, are actually, begging or resorting to maybe stealing to, to survive. And they have no value for education. Even if they are the ones who, would rather have their children steal or, beg than put them. So they feel, like if they have their child, it's better the child begs and earns money for them or steals and gets something home rather than go to the school and waste the time over there. So you do have these different classes of, so the situation is different. I don't know how it is, elsewhere. But we do, so we, like I mentioned earlier also, so we do have these, non-government organizations, and we do have these individuals who try and reach out to these families and children and lure them with, food and, with clothes, so, and provide them free education.
Yes.
We have some, who provide shelter to the street children. So the parents may be on the streets, but they provide shelter to the children. They take them to the schools, they provide them education. But there is, but there's much to be done, and a lot of, children to be reached out to. But where special education is concerned, so I'm talking about basic education now, where special education is concerned, even public schools, or what you would call government-funded schools do not have those provisions or resources. So a lot of the children who get identified with having, a specific learning disability, or say autism, or, with ADHD, or with, some other disorder, they do not have any help or support from the school or from the government.
Right.
In India, we don't have government help or funding.
Yes.
So that is, something that we have been fighting for. So for example, a learning disability or even autism, okay, let's say, learning disability is hidden. only if you have someone or you have it, you would know what it is to have a learning disability. But autism is something which is not all that hidden. You know, it's you can see that there is something amiss in that child. So something like autism also wasn't recognized. So there was no help for children with autism. So it was only as recent as 2016 December that the government recognized that there is something like autism and learning disability, and that these children need to be identified and need to be provided for. So that's as recent as.
Right. And currently they are being therefore supported within government
They
schools.
are, again, you know, there is no government funding, but at least the schools, now it's become mandatory in schools, like it's a law now, that you have to identify these children as early as possible and provide them the support in the school. As yet, there is no mention of, you know, financial funding or that kind, but at least, you know, the schools cannot deprive these children of education. They cannot deny them the support or the accommodations they require in terms of extra time or a support teacher or, you know, a reader, a writer.
Right.
You know. So at least, you know, that has become mandatory, but it's still a law. Implementation is still a long way away, but at least there is some relief that at least now the government has recognized it, and so if a parent approaches a school, the school cannot say that, you know, we cannot
deny
help
them.
this child. Yes.
Understood. And you know, as you were talking about the municipal schools and the government schools and the private schools, and how some parents, despite, you know, being tight with their income, would try to send their children to private school, it reminds me of some of the experiences of some Singaporeans. They would actually shift homes so that they are closer to these elite schools,
Right.
because there's a belief that their child will be better supported, the child will have a better access to quality education compared to, say, your neighborhood schools. And while in Singapore, perhaps the challenges that we face may not be so obvious and come across as something very severe, there are these subtle barriers to learning, perhaps. And I wanted to ask Siang this question. So in some instances where, you know, in some of the countries that we've heard of, there may not be an appropriate school for the child to go to, which then provides the right appropriate support for that child. In some cases, and perhaps maybe this is more reflective of the challenge Singapore faces, is the notion of a limited supply of trained teachers or qualified teachers to help with special educational needs, or maybe even an equal distribution of resources amongst all schools. So what do you think? I would like your opinion on what you think some of the barriers are to access education for those who are learning disabled and economically challenged in Singapore.
Well, first of all, I think the government has already included quite a bit of resources in our government schools. But again, the question is whether that is adequate. We know that every primary school in Singapore and selected secondary schools have allied educators who are trained to support those with learning difficulties. We know that up to 20% of all teachers have additional training in special needs. But as I said, the question is whether that is adequate. And on top of that, I mentioned absenteeism just now, right? And that, although that's a symptom, right, the barriers that result in absenteeism are things that we need to address, right? And we are not blaming the parents here because we understand their problem, right? You know, it may be a dual income household. Both parents are busy working. They do not have a maid or someone else to bring the children for additional classes. And so these are all things that we do need to overcome or help the families to overcome. So these are some of the barriers that we need to tackle as we look at Singaporean families.
Yes. And we've already established, for instance, that increasing overlap between financial challenges and learning disabilities. And this is a question that's linked to a question the audience, one of the audience members asked. And again, I read this, that the higher than affluent, so we do have a disproportionate number of learners with needs belonging to these low-income households. So in terms of considering that fine balance between providing the special education support for learners who might need it, and often this might result in pull-out systems, right, where the child is withdrawn from an existing program or a class. And sometimes the question is, how certain are we that this child might have a learning disability and it's not a poverty-related issue? And then denying them educational experiences that might be available in a generalist classroom. So in terms of that fine balance, how do we make ourselves...
Well, I think that's a very interesting question. Thank you for that. I think what we have to do is to make sure that children are in a place where they can benefit from those experiences that they would have. And if they haven't got whether it's because of a special need or whether it's because of the added effects of poverty, they need to be at a particular level before they're able to benefit. So when you talk about children coming into school, if they're not ready to learn, then there's no way that any of these beautiful experiences will be of help to them. They will all pass over them. They will be lost within the system, unable to process because they don't know what's expected of them and what they're supposed to do. So we have to get the children to a level where they're able to benefit. And so that is the key to then opening up the potential for them to be able to access a whole range of experiences, different types of education. Yes. But without that, then they're going to be, even if they're within a system where they could benefit, then they won't benefit.
Right. And I think a lot of our parents and even our students, when we talk to them, some feel that they're excluded from certain activities because they're not academically the top in the class. Yes. So often we hear our students feeling very disappointed that they were not selected for robotics or the chess team because they're not one of the top students in class. And how would you respond to that sort of sentiment?
What we should be looking for each child is their individual strengths. We saw those children this morning and how able they were to perform, how really competent and talented they were. Each child has a talent, and we should be looking for those strengths, to build on those strengths, not just looking for... we shouldn't just be looking for the highest achiever. We should be looking for the one who's made the most progress, for the one who normally can't speak at all, but today spoke. It's those sorts of things that are important. Those are the things that change a child's life. They then see themselves as a person that could speak. I could do it again. And this is what you need to be doing, feeding back to those children that being part of the school, being part of a society is something that they can do. And that will make a big difference to those children.
So helping them find a place within the school
system. Find their niche. Not just in school, in life.
Yes.
That's the most important thing. Knowing where you belong, where you can make a difference, where you can be yourself, be fulfilled. That's the key.
In fact, this links back to the question on inclusion. Yeah. And there's this, as we know, there's this big debate on whether physical integration in schools is adequate, or must children be adequately included educationally. And very often when we talk about educational inclusion, we are talking about children with specific learning difficulties or disability, physical disabilities. We really should be talking about including children who are from impoverished backgrounds as well.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think now we'll get right down to some, straight facts and details about how we can go about making a change. And one question here, this is for Siang. So if so many poor children are not taught or exposed to the variety of career opportunities, we're talking about life after school, within and outside of their communities, and and we know for a fact it's not a lack of motivation, rather a lack of information. So how important then is advocacy work, and who should take the lead in this?
I guess it goes back to one of my points earlier. While we want to continue to engage and encourage the families to take the lead in encouraging their own children, I think society needs to play a very, very big role here as well. And we must go beyond the basic response to dyslexia and other learning difficulties as well. Right now, most of the time we are talking about providing a literacy program for those with dyslexia, right? Really, we need to be talking about a comprehensive and holistic range of programs.
Absolutely.
And because we know that children from better resourced families, they have options. Their parents will give them a very wide range of experiences. That is not available to children from lower income families, right? And that is what we need to provide this range of experiences for these children as well. I mean, our speech and drama program is one such effort. I think we should be looking at a lot more of these options.
So it's a whole community effort. Teachers, parents, mentors, students who have grown out of school and right now working, all of us involved in raising this sort of an awareness?
Yes.
And Mandy, this is for you. So poverty is not always clear to spot unless it's so regionalized or localized. But what are some of the signs our teachers can look out for so that when they work with children, they can spot these signs?
Well, I guess this is a quite a challenging question, and it does depend a lot on the community in which people live. I think sometimes children or families who are struggling work very hard to prevent people from seeing that. So to some degree, when the children arrive in the classroom, there may not be the very obvious signs that they are struggling financially, that perhaps they haven't had breakfast that morning, or perhaps there are a lot of financial issues in the home that are causing stress and anxiety. So, it can be quite subtle, and the red flags might be related to children who clearly are a little hungry, that there are some indicators that they're forgetting their lunch on a daily basis, or whatever it happens to be, depending on the school. So some of those indicators of neglect might be there, but not always. Sometimes there is an indication that the child is from a background of poverty that is related to their perhaps lower language capabilities. So we see children who don't have the same level of vocabulary, don't have the same kind of range of experience to draw on, and you can kind of pick up the subtle cues around their developing language. Being cautious that we're not seeing a kind of developmental language disorder potentially there. So I think there are these kind of little red flags. The indicator of stress, the fact that they, when it comes to, there's an excursion and everyone's supposed to bring their $5 or whatever it happens to be, and this child consistently doesn't. There are those subtle things, and obviously there are sometimes the more overt indicators, which I think are quite clear. Perhaps the reverse is actually more often the case, where because children are living in poverty, we don't look at the fact that there is a learning disorder or a language disorder or other possible things happening there for that child. So again, when I was talking about the Aboriginal communities, I would say the number of Aboriginal students in Australia who have ever been identified as having a learning disorder such as dyslexia, probably less than 10. I mean, it is just not... The assumption is that they have poor language and literacy because they are Aboriginal and they are poor, and it's the same in low SES areas. So I think for me it's almost the reverse question that is the challenge. It is, how do we make sure that we are picking up those students who are living in poverty, who are disadvantaged, and who are having added to their disadvantage a underlying persistent and enduring learning disorder, who we are not picking up and we are not supporting. I guess, to be honest, I am of the view that we need to be ensuring that all children, no matter what their circumstance, no matter what their position in society, are given the best possible chance of becoming literate, numerate, engaging with the world, discovering all of the extraordinary things that are out there, and having the choice to do what they want in their futures. So it's kind of like that bridge from helping children with learning disorders to helping all children who are struggling, no matter what the underlying causative factor, I think there's a bit of a grey and murky area in there, and you know which direction we're heading is a bit of a kind of almost a conundrum that we all face in these organisations. Yeah.
And I was going to ask you, Mandy, in being fully aware of that, the fact that, you know, we need to look at these low SES populations and identify the learners who need this additional help in terms of education, how successful has it been? What has worked and what hasn't?
Okay, so I'll be completely honest.
Yes, please.
In many cases, I just don't go there because the focus I have is let's improve literacy for all children. So let's get that right first. And if we can change what is happening in a school or in a community, increase that level of urgency, recognise that in some cases we just must not try to rely on the families to pick up the slack, that what has to happen for 6.5 hours every day in the classroom is absolutely the best possible opportunity for those children. So the focus is let's get that kind of what we would refer to as first wave of instruction absolutely right. Let's address that with a sense of urgency. Let's put in place intervention for any child who is struggling, no matter what the cause. Let's resource those teachers, let's train them and so on. And then we will find that in general, literacy will improve. And we see this all of the time. And then you can see the children who do have those persistent and enduring difficulties. You can identify them and you can provide them with that additional level of support, intervention, the adjustments that they need.
And I'd also like to say early screening, I think, is absolutely crucial. Looking for strengths as well as weaknesses, because then you can see that profile where there are some areas where the child is really good and some where they're really bad, and then you can use those strengths to help to build on those weaknesses.
So no child left behind, a right to education for all, and a tiered approach to support the learners. So, I mean, we're quickly winding down because we're running out of time. So I've got one question that I think I'll only be able to ask maybe two people. I'm going to just ask the question and let's see who picks the mic to answer this one, all right? Okay, so let's say tomorrow, all of us representing here, we're representing 5 countries, which is amazing on stage, 5 countries. Say all of you become ministers of education. You've got the power, you've got the resources to make the decisions and laws that will change things for the children and their parents. So if there was one change you could make to secure access to education for all, as Mandy has so eloquently put, what would it be? All right.
Thank you.
Where India is concerned, free education for all. Because, you know, we don't have
Yes, let's clap for that. Free education for all.
Okay. For me, in Kenya, we have now free education for all, which is mandatory. But I would include the teacher training at every teacher training institute in the curriculum of their training, learning about how to identify and how to intervene. As it is, early intervention is very important, and early identification, which will lead to early intervention. So it should be included in all teacher training in curriculum, whatever the level, in colleges, at the university, and all.
Well
Thank
said.
you.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with what everyone has said. But in the UK, we have talked for years about the need for all teachers to be trained in special needs. It still hasn't happened. Now they're talking about having hubs where one trained teacher works with 100 schools. Rubbish.
Well, Angela, you'd be the education minister. What would you do?
Absolutely. I would go to the government, and I'd say stop messing about with all this Brexit nonsense. Let's talk about the important things.
And Mandy, yes.
Yes, so I would add to what everybody has said, totally agree with everything, but I do think it comes back to agreeing with Phyllis, the expertise of the teachers and the resourcing of the teachers in schools, and I think it is about early identification and early intervention, but alongside that, it is about better knowledge of instruction, better knowledge of the science of reading, understanding our complex and complicated language and the history of it, and a whole lot of other factors that contribute to a teacher being able to both instruct really well in English, pick up where the subtle weaknesses are and address those. It is, as somebody like Louisa Moats would say, it is rocket science, and we need to be ensuring that everybody has the skills to deliver instruction really effectively.
Well, what we really want to do is empower the teachers so they know how to deal with it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, you've heard it, ladies and gentlemen. A proposal will be going through with all of these requests. And I'm sad to say this, but it's time for us to end the panel discussion. And I want to say thank you very much for a very lively and open discussion this morning.